Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and a lot of times my newer systems, the ones that are over here on the right, and the oldest of my systems that's all the way over there on the left, sometimes there remains a little bit of an overlap until such a time that I can really bring complete closure to the end of a older system. And that's kind of because I tend to use this process of migrating the worms out of their old material, and occasionally that process doesn't really complete as quickly as it can. So the case that we're going to be talking about today is with the so-called original red wiggler worms, and the two new systems that I launched 23 days ago with my original red wigglers can be seen over here stacked one on top of the other, but there's still worms remaining in the box that these worms were pulled out of. And that box is right here, similarly marked as original red wigglers. That migration process that I referred to a moment ago is really just trying to leave their old material to sort of air dry and become a little bit less hospitable for worms to stay in, while at the same time creating a nice plastic covered environment where the moisture does stay put, stays nice and damp. And then I also apply food to the side where I want to try to bring the worms over to. And can you believe it? It's been 10 weeks now, 70 days since I actually initiated the migration of the worms out of both of these systems. This system's even older. Both of these systems have already surpassed 1 year since they were launched. And in the case of the original worms, we actually managed to do the haul out of the worms, like I said a moment ago, 23 days ago to launch those two new bins. It was only 14 days ago that we got around to finally getting the first haul out of worms from there. So my thinking was, material in here is getting pretty dry, and I think that the worms are probably almost all, if not all, in the collection zone, in the horizontal migration feeding zone. So I want to do a haul out, possibly the final haul out of that system, so we can finally harvest their castings. And it's been 10 days now since we checked in on the original worms and fed them, so I think they're due for a feeding too. So we're going to try to do a little family reunion, bring the last of the worms that were stragglers in the old system in here with the new bins. That'll enable us to harvest the castings, and also at the same time get these guys over here fed. So I'm going to get the old bin, do the haul out first, see how that goes, and then we'll proceed to getting these up on the bench to feed them and to release the worms we gathered into there. So let's get to work. This plastic container comes in really handy. It's about the right size to usually permit me to unload one of these horizontal migration feeding zones and do the haul out of the worms. Although in previous such situations where I've done the haul outs, I've done so using a couple different containers. I figured I would see what we could do about, maybe doing it with a single container, putting all the worms into a single box. And then I guess I also thought about maybe splitting up the worms that we haul out here and releasing some into one bin and some into the other bin. Because I do remember one of the bins being somewhat less in terms of population size. So with everyone's input, we came up with some estimates on how many worms occupy those two new bins that we launched the original red wigglers into when we did the first haul out. And we did end up with one system having almost 100 more worms in it than the other. Not much of a difference, so we came pretty close to dividing up the population evenly. And, I didn't even take any note of what those numbers actually were, because I wasn't too interested in trying to use those numbers as something to try to adhere to or use as a goal or anything like that. I really wanted to just get the haul out done, and maybe even just sort of, I don't know, I can't remember at this point which of the bins was the one that was more populated. Maybe just dump whatever worms have gathered into the horizontal migration feeding zone and, drop them into the bin that was estimated to have the fewer worms in it, which would probably push it over to becoming the more populated bin out of the two. So, you know what? A lot of chit chat. Let's get to work and check out some worms. So a lot of times I'll put down some sort of a divider to try to keep the nice casting separate from whatever's going on in the feeding area in the migration zone. So I think we'll eventually excavate to the point where we encounter that. But I'd really like to get a reality check on whether or not this depopulation of the castings was successful or not. The reason I thought it took so long, because the stuff had remained so damp for so long, the worms just had no real reason to exit. So the main mission to try to motivate the worms to leave this material was to promote the drying of the material, leaving it uncovered, oftentimes, not oftentimes, but occasionally stirring the dry stuff on the surface down into the lower reaches of the bin, and at the same time surfacing the more damp stuff down low. And even when we were in here last time to feed the other two new bins that we're going to check in next, 10 days ago, we did do a quick check-in to see how things were progressing in here. At that time, we still saw a few straggler worms remaining in the material, but very few, and then I did come back here off camera briefly to see what I could see, and it seemed to me like even then, that was maybe a week ago at this point, because I think I came in 3 days after our last check-in, and that was on video, and then I came back again a few days later. I can't remember the exact timing of things, but even then, quite a few days ago, I felt like maybe we had already achieved the goal of seeing the finished castings depopulated. And I'm not sure how long I've been stirring stuff here, but I'm fairly convinced that I've not seen any worms. Maybe I was not paying close enough attention, maybe I was distracted, maybe there was a worm in there that I missed, but if I did, then that's certainly, I think, within the acceptable tolerances for trying to get worms to depopulate castings. So I think we're going to treat this as an official completion of this system, which I've even got some numbers here, and geez, we haven't even seen a single worm yet. 388 days. I did take some notes here. 388 days was when this system was originally launched. Like I said, 23 days ago was haul out number 1, and I believe haul out number 2, which we're doing now, is going to bring the remainder of the worms out of this material so we can reunite them with their friends and neighbors and their family over in the 2 new systems, or maybe just in one of the new systems. I don't know, we'll have to decide. So let's get this haul out completed, then we'll be done here. These castings will be officially harvestable at this point. And it's usually at this point I try to get some feedback from the viewers on, hey, how many worms did we actually add to a system or launch a new system with? So I can see a lot of bedding and not many worms quite yet. Maybe I'm just missing the point where they're all gathering. Let's keep searching to see how many worms were really left behind when we did the first haul out. Here too, maybe a pile of coffee that didn't really get nibbled away. Once again, worms throughout the material, but no big mass of worms in any one particular spot. So we're going to be bringing in over a good bit of bedding with this haul out to be placed into one of the new systems. I'm almost starting to wonder if we might end up with an estimate that's going to almost level off the worm count in the 2 systems if we were to place these worms into the lesser populated bin. And I guess I'll have to run upstairs to check my tracking spreadsheet, because offhand I can't remember which of the 2 new bins was estimated to have the fewer number of worms in it. But I think we're already at that point where we can pretty much consider this haul out as done. I guess I'm going to just try to make sure that I've also not left behind a whole bunch of debris within these nice castings. I mean, when I do it this way, I don't feel like I need to sift. I feel like these are just, harvested castings that are good the way they are, so I like to try to limit the amount of debris that's stuck in it. So when I finally get around to using the material out in the garden, I would hate to be littering my garden with all kinds of pieces of shredded paper and cardboard that makes up my bedding. So I'm just taking that extra couple of seconds here to fish out any last lingering pieces of cardboard that might have been left behind, and perhaps more importantly, to get the worms out, to make sure that the the reunion is complete and we haven't left anyone behind. But I'm fairly certain at this point that we've got an almost completely depopulated batch of castings here. And our second and final haul out of this 388-day system. 10 weeks to migrate the worms out. Although that might be an exaggeration. I think the worms might have already been out of here some time ago. Perhaps even a week ago. So, that's it. That makes it official. Look at those beautiful castings. Stuff is definitely nice. But we're not here to gawk at castings. We're here to gawk at worms. So, I'm going to put this aside and tend to the whole thing of emptying the bin and whatever. But this is the official end of this system now. And it's time to bring out the other two bins so we can get them fed and to release the gathered worms into the lesser populated of the two new systems. Let's make that happen next. So here's the numbers. Bin number 1 to your left, 2230. Bin number 2 to your right, 2276. And I guess because bin number 1 is thought to have the fewer number of worms, shy by 46 worms, we're going to be adding the hauled out worms from haul out number 2 into bin number 1. And it might be a little bit more than just 46 worms that we just pulled out. So I've got a feeling bin number 1 is going to turn into the bin that's got the greater number of worms living in it. So let's get the feeding done first so we can just get that out of the way, and then the food will be in place. And then all we'll need to do afterwards is drop in the hauled out worms, and then we'll be finished. Man, 388 days. Crazy. It was on day 365 when the old bin had reached 1 year of age that we decided it was time to get the first haul out done. And now 23 days later, it seems like we've succeeded in getting the last of the worms rounded up. So now these new systems, you know, after only a couple weeks in service, 3.5 weeks in service, there's still a whole lot of bedding in here. So bin number 1 is going to benefit from getting all that bedding that came out of the horizontal migration feeding zone from the old system. And there was also some of that other stuff that came out. There was that partition, that cardboard partition. There was a piece of newspaper. So I'm thinking instead of going crazy by supplementing the bedding in these systems using any sort of a fresh, unused material, we would just utilize what we've already got in terms of the partition divider and that piece of newspaper that came out of the old system, as well as all that bedding that came along with the worms from the horizontal migration feeding zone. I guess my only interest here was to take some of that dry stuff that I saw around the edges, which was not covered with the bubble wrap, where things had dried a little bit. Try to blend it in a little with the surrounding material so that it doesn't just sit there all dry and get no attention. And give all the material in the system a fair shot at getting work done. And I'm just wondering if we're going to actually be able to perceive that 46 worm difference between the two systems. Seems very unlikely when you're talking about systems that have populations in them that are estimated to be in excess of 2,200 worms. That difference of a few dozen worms is probably not one that's going to be easily recognizable. So I've sort of deliberately avoided tilling up the middle of the second bin, and now I'm in the first bin. I figured I would do the same here, just avoid tilling up the middle, because that's where we last fed. And my assumption is that, you know, that's where we're probably going to find some worms gathered, either still working on the food they got 10 days ago during the last check-in, or maybe they've eaten what they already got. And I can't remember what they got last time, but maybe we'll spot some leftovers. So why don't we excavate the feeding zone so that we could drop in what they're getting today. Today it's just banana peels and coffee. Nothing too elaborate. So I guess one of the things that often comes with the foods that they get is moisture too. So if it's not actually the food that they got last time that draws the worms to the feeding area, it could also just be the moisture that comes with it, or a combination of both. But it usually is fair to expect that the worms are going to be near the feeding zone. And now it's starting to come back to me. Some of the stuff that they got last time was apple peel. We're starting to see some of that already here as leftovers. Because the peel of the apple definitely seems to take a little while. The other thing that I remember adding to that feeding is broccoli. And broccoli after 10 days seems like something that the worms would probably not leave many leftovers of. So if we see a little flash of green, I would actually be surprised, because then that would just be leftovers of the broccoli, which seems somewhat unlikely. Okay, we've created the trench into which we can drop the feeding for bin number 1. Let's do the same over here in bin number 2. Again, bin number 2 is the one estimated to house the greater number of worms in it. Right there, it seems like we hit a hot spot of something that the worms are definitely enjoying. Whether it's the food itself that they're enjoying over there or a little pocket of moisture, I don't know. But I'm already definitely getting a little bit of a vibe from this system telling me that there probably are, in fact, more worms living in here. It almost seems significantly more. So I don't know if we just missed where the worms are hiding in the other system. But I don't want to, try dialing in any of the estimated numbers. I only estimate the worm population based on what's observed during the launch day. So I have no intention of trying to calibrate anything for what we're seeing here today. The only thing I'm interested in is figuring out what everyone thinks is the worm count that's going into bin number 1 after we launch them in there. But before we can do that, we've got to get the feeding out of the way, right? So we're going to bring in some of the stuff that we talked about earlier. There was that partition, right? The cardboard partition that separated the feeding zone from the finished castings, keep it from getting contaminated. And that's this. That seemed like a nice piece of extra bedding to go down underneath the feeding. And I figured since this system's getting all that extra bedding that comes from the horizontal migration feeding zone, I would use the slightly larger piece of cardboard here, so that the amount of overall bedding get placed into each of these systems is somewhat equivalent. Because I do like the idea of trying to treat both systems equally for the most part, and give them similar quantities of stuff. So in that same vein, each system's going to get 2 banana peels. 2 banana peels or 3? 3 it seems. I've got a whole bunch of melon rind up in my fridge too, but I started noticing how the banana peels were really stacking up, so I figured instead of trying to deplete my surplus of melon rinds, I would instead see about doing away with some of this banana peel instead. And we've also got ourselves a nice feeding zone indicator, which I don't think we had in here. I didn't notice that we had any, although it might have been stuck to the top covering papers if we had one. I just don't recall seeing it. Alright, so I think we can go ahead and level things off here over the feeding zone. Before we do so completely, I've got my grit here. Why don't we throw a little bit of grit down into the feeding zone too. In these new bins, I like to try to be generous with the grit, since the systems are built without any grit. So this way they've got what they need to be able to break down their foods. And before we position the feeding zone into bin number 1, the feeding zone indicator, I mean, we've got to release our worms. And then we can cover up with the feeding zone indicator. So it'll get placed right over where we last fed, just like that. But before we can do that over here, we've got the final business at hand. So here, once again, besides seeing the worms as we're pulling them out of their old home, this is going to be our last chance to see how many worms are being added to bin number 1. So I look forward to everyone's input. Please leave a comment. Let me know how many worms we're adding to bin number 1 here. so I can update our records and update the averaging calculations to make sure it's all representative of what everyone thinks. So here again, like I usually do, I'll spread this stuff out a little bit just so I can get a better glimpse at how many worms actually got released into here. I got to admit, I thought there'd be a whole lot more, but I guess what's most important is that we got them all, as far as I can tell. And a lot of times when we do this, I'll run the camera quickly, so it's a little bit easier to see the worms when their motion is sped up. So let's do that for a moment or two. Well, it looks to me like they're all out of view. Maybe there's still the tail or two still visible, but I don't see it. And besides that, I think we've given these little guys enough attention for one day. Let's let them rest and get to work on eating some of those banana peels and some of that coffee. I think they're going to appreciate that. So, I don't know, what do you think? Please let me know how many worms we just released into here, and then whatever we average, all of our guesstimates will be added to the original estimate of how many worms live in here. And then that'll become the new official worm count for bin number 1. It'll be interesting to see what we end up with. It'd be kind of funny if the average of what we all estimated to have just been released into here today was 46, which would bring the estimated worm count of both bins into perfect alignment with each other. Maybe for fun, that'll be my estimate. Alright everyone, that's it for the check-in. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.